The castle was alive with the echoes of celebration. Yet beneath the golden chandeliers and flowing wine, an unspoken tension lingered. The young bride, draped in silk and jewels, was the picture of innocence, unknowing, trusting. The prince took her hand, his grip firm yet cold, and with the ceremonial dagger, he sliced their palms, merging their blood. A sacred act, they called it, a bond unbreakable. But to those who knew the truth, this was not a union, it was a sentence. The whispers behind closed doors spoke of sacrifice, of a fate sealed long before vows were exchanged. Her father stood at the altar, a forced smile masking the weight in his eyes. He had done what he must, ensuring his family's honor. But at what cost? The girl's mother wept silently, her fingers gripping the embroidery of her gown, as if holding on to something, anything, that might stop what was to come. Betrayal had taken root within the very fabric of royalty, a deception spun so intricately that even the victim dared not suspect. The illusion of love and loyalty was the greatest trick the court had ever played. The crowd erupted into applause as the prince lifted his bride into his arms. A grand gesture meant to signify devotion. Yet the warmth of his hands was nothing but an illusion. She smiled at him, her heart pounding with the excitement of new beginnings. Little did she know, this was not the beginning of a love story, but the first act of a medieval drama woven in blood and lies. A life built on deceit, wrapped in the silk of tradition, bound by an oath that meant her survival was never the goal. The procession led them to the stone bridge that overlooked the abyss, the kingdom's most sacred ground, or so she had been told. The wind howled, its icy breath sending shivers down her spine. The prince whispered words of comfort, but there was no tenderness in his voice. Something shifted in his gaze, cold, distant, resolute. She did not recognize the man she had pledged herself to. And then, before she could question, before doubt could take root, she was falling. Her scream echoed through the void, her body weightless in the dark descent. The betrayal struck before the ground ever did. This was not a mistake, not a cruel joke. This was planned. Her mind raced as she plummeted, the echoes of celebration fading into the abyss. Her life, her dreams, her very existence had been traded for something unseen, something lurking in the shadows of history. The royal family had not chosen her for marriage. They had chosen her for sacrifice. The impact never came. The fall ended in darkness, in the suffocating grip of an unknown world. The stone beneath her palms was slick with moisture, the air thick with an unfamiliar heat. A rumble, distant yet undeniable, vibrated through the cavern. She wasn't alone. She had been thrown into the depths not to be forgotten, but to be claimed. And then, the ground beneath her trembled. Something moved in the darkness. Something ancient, something that had been waiting. The girl, still gasping for breath, had no time to comprehend the horror that had unfolded. Because in the silence, beneath the weight of betrayal, a new terror was awakening. The silence was heavier than the stone walls that trapped her. Every breath she took was thick with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something ancient, something alive. She pressed her palms against the cavern floor, trying to still the tremble in her hands. Survival. That was all that mattered now. But how could she escape a place she didn't even understand? The only thing she knew for certain was that she had been thrown here to die. And yet, fate had a cruel sense of humor, because she was still breathing. She stumbled forward, her fingers grazing the cold walls, searching for anything, an opening, a ledge, a way out. Then she saw them. Scattered around her were remnants of jewelry, torn silks, rusted crowns. The realization hit her like a blade to the gut. She was not the first. Dozens had been here before her. Brides, just like her, tossed away like offerings to something unseen. The thought sent a chill down her spine, colder than any winter wind. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a cycle, a curse, a medieval drama written in blood and sacrifice. A flicker of light caught her eye. In the distance, something burned, small yet wild. She crept toward it, heart hammering in her chest. A bird, its body engulfed in flames, flapped its wings weakly before falling still. Empathy swelled within her, an emotion she had no time for, yet couldn't ignore. She knelt, brushing dirt over the embers, but it was too late. The creature was gone. And then the air shifted. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the cavern. The heat thickened. She wasn't alone. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head. The shadows on the cavern wall twisted, expanded. A claw, massive and razor-sharp, scraped against the stone. A pair of glowing eyes, as deep and endless as the abyss itself, flickered open. The dragon was real, and it was waking up. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a monster from the old stories, a legend told to frighten children. This was flesh, scales, and fury, and she was standing right in its domain. Instinct took over. She ran. Her feet barely found purchase on the uneven ground as she stumbled through the darkness. Behind her, the dragon inhaled sharply, and then fire. Heat roared past her, scorching the air, turning the cavern into a blazing inferno. She barely made it into a narrow tunnel, her shoulders slamming against the wall as she gasped for air. The fire had seared her leg, pain radiating through her body, but she was alive. Somehow, she was still alive. A voice, deep and otherworldly, echoed through the cavern. "Did I hurt you?" The dragon spoke. It wasn't a mindless beast. It wasn't the monster she had been raised to fear. She pressed her back against the stone, heart racing. Compassion and survival warred within her. One whispering to listen, the other screaming to run. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary sacrifice. This was something else entirely. And as the dragon's breath filled the air once more, she knew this was only the beginning. The girl had barely caught her breath when the ground trembled once more. But this time, it wasn't the dragon. It was something else, something human. The clash of metal, the sharp ring of steel striking stone, and then voices. Men shouting orders. Knights! A rescue party. For the first time since she had been thrown into the abyss, hope flickered inside her. She wasn't alone. Someone had come for her. But hope, like everything else in this cursed kingdom, was a fragile thing. The first knight stepped into the cavern, torch raised high, his face hard with determination. More followed, swords drawn, their eyes scanning the darkness. They moved with the confidence of men who believed they were here to slay a mindless beast and take back what belonged to their kingdom. But they didn't understand. They couldn't. The dragon was not what they thought it was, and neither was she. She opened her mouth to warn them, but it was already too late. A growl, low and menacing, rolled through the cavern like distant thunder. The torches flickered. The knights hesitated, and then fire. A wall of flames erupted from the shadows, forcing them to scatter, their shining armor useless against the raw fury of the beast. The dragon emerged, its massive form blocking any hope of escape. Its wings unfurled, sending gusts of hot air whipping through the cavern. These men had come to fight, but they had no idea what they were up against. The first clash was brutal. Swords struck scales, arrows found their mark, but the dragon did not falter. It was not a mindless creature. It was intelligent, vengeful. These knights weren't saviors. They were invaders. The girl watched in horror as one was snatched midair, his body crushed between enormous claws before being tossed aside like a broken doll. Another swung his blade, but the dragon's tail struck first, sending him crashing into the stone walls. This was not a battle. This was a massacre. She could do nothing but watch as the dragon tore through the so-called heroes. Men who had no idea they were fighting the wrong war. It wasn't just about survival anymore. The dragon was not merely defending its territory. It was punishing them. For centuries of betrayal, for the countless sacrifices, for the pain it had endured. And as the girl stood frozen in the chaos, she realized something terrible. She wasn't sure who she was supposed to be rooting for. The prince's banner, carried by one of the knights, fell to the ground, its golden insignia scorched beyond recognition. It was a symbol of power, of control, of a kingdom that had thrived on bloodshed and lies. And now it burned. The dragon roared, its voice shaking the very foundation of the cavern. There would be no rescue. There would be no heroes. The kingdom's warriors had met their fate, and the girl was left standing between two worlds, one of humans, who had betrayed her, and one of a beast, who might just be the only one telling the truth. And as the last night fell, silence returned. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something far worse, the moment before the truth comes crashing down. Smoke curled toward the heavens, blackening the sky above the kingdom. The castle, once a monument of power, stood against the horizon like a dying beast, crumbling, suffocating under the weight of its own sins. The girl, bloodied and exhausted, watched from the outskirts of the battlefield, her heart pounding with something she couldn't yet name. Was it fear? Satisfaction? Perhaps both. The monarchy's rule had been built on sacrifice, on betrayal, on the silent screams of countless girls before her. And now, the walls that once concealed those crimes were burning. The dragon had not stopped with the knights. It had taken its fury to the source, the royal family. Fire rained from the sky as nobles scattered, their silk robes turning to ash before they could even scream. The prince, the one who had smiled so sweetly as he condemned her to death, was among them. He ran, sword in hand, barking orders that no one listened to. His voice, once laced with arrogance, now cracked with desperation. He was no longer a ruler. He was prey. The girl should have felt vindicated. She had dreamed of this moment. But then why did her chest feel so hollow? A queen's shriek cut through the chaos. A desperate mother, grasping at fate with trembling hands. The girl turned just in time to see her sister being dragged toward the temple, forced to her knees as the priests prepared yet another sacrifice. History was repeating itself, spinning its web of deception once more. The monarchy had always found a way to survive, weaving its crimes into rituals, dressing its betrayals in tradition. And here it was happening again. Only this time, the girl was no longer a pawn. The crowd was too terrified to resist. They bowed to power, even as their city burned around them. The girl pushed through them, her voice lost beneath the roars of fire and panic. She reached for her sister, just as the priests raised the ceremonial dagger. The same dagger that had cut her own palm on the day she was wed. The same dagger that had marked her for death. The cycle was endless until someone broke it. And so, she did. The blade met flesh, but not in the way the priests had intended. She struck first. The old men collapsed, their blood soaking the temple steps. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one moved. No one dared. The girl turned, facing them all, her voice raw with anger. No more. She spat, her words heavy with something undeniable. The fire around them crackled, the dragon's wings casting shadows over a kingdom teetering on the edge of ruin. The choice was theirs now. Would they let the monarchy rebuild its lies? Or would they burn it down for good? The prince, charred and bleeding, stumbled toward them, eyes wild with fury. "You don't understand," he hissed. "Without the sacrifices, the dragon will never stop." But the girl knew better. The sacrifices had never been for the dragon. They had been for the monarchy, to keep their power, to silence dissent, to turn fear into control. And now, that fear belonged to them. The dragon loomed overhead, waiting, watching, and as the girl tightened her grip on the blood-stained dagger, she realized that she was no longer fighting for survival. She was fighting for something greater. She was fighting to end the nightmare once and for all. The air was thick with the scent of scorched earth and blood. But for the first time, the girl felt the weight of choice resting in her hands. The dragon hovered above the ruins of the kingdom, its golden eyes locked onto her, waiting. It had every reason to finish what it started, to incinerate the last remnants of a dynasty that had betrayed it for generations. And yet it did not move, because now everything depended on her. The cycle of sacrifice and revenge had reached its breaking point, and only one question remained. Would she continue the bloodshed or end it? The prince lay at her feet, his once pristine robes reduced to rags, his crown lost in the debris. He wasn't a ruler anymore, just a man who had played his part in a cruel legacy. He lifted his head, eyes burning with defiance, with the desperate belief that the world still belonged to him. "Kill me," he spat, as if daring her to do it, as if he thought that revenge would make her just like him. And for a moment, she almost did. Every bone in her body ached for justice. Every scar reminded her of the betrayal that had almost cost her life. But something held her back. She turned instead to the dragon, stepping toward it, unarmed. The crowd gasped. The beast lowered its head, the heat of its breath washing over her, scorching but not burning. She raised her palm, the same hand that had once been bound in marriage, marked for sacrifice. "They tricked you," she whispered, her voice raw but certain. "They made you believe we were the enemy, but we were just pawns." The dragon let out a slow exhale, its gaze searching hers. For the first time, she saw it not as a monster, but as something else, something broken, something betrayed just like her. The dragon hesitated, its massive frame shifting. It had been enslaved by hatred for so long, bound by the same cycle of destruction that had ruled this kingdom. But now it was free. The girl reached into her pocket and pulled out a handful of glowing insects, the creatures that had healed her wounds in the depths of the cavern. Carefully, she stepped closer and placed them near the dragon's scorched scales. The wounds that covered its body began to mend, the magic of the cave working as it had for her. She was offering something no one else ever had: compassion. The prince watched in disbelief, his expression twisting between rage and horror. "You can't," he growled. "This isn't how the story ends." But that was where he was wrong. This wasn't his story anymore. The girl met his gaze, calm and unshaken. "No," she said simply. "This is how it begins." And with those words, the dragon turned its head to the sky and let out a final, deafening roar, not of rage, but of liberation. The castle's last tower crumbled behind them, the kingdom falling not to fire, but to the weight of its own sins. The people who had once followed blindly now stood in silence, witnessing the impossible. A girl who had been cast away, standing side by side with the creature they had been told to fear. This wasn't survival. This was redemption. The girl had been willing to fight, to burn it all down if she had to. But in the end, mercy had proven stronger than vengeance. And as she stepped forward, leaving behind the ruins of the past, she knew that legends weren't written by those who destroyed. They were written by those who dared to rebuild.